In the year 1868, in a remote stretch of Wyoming territory, a young woman is said to have run one of the deadliest inns in the American West, luring in travelers, poisoning them for their money, and burying them in her own backyard. 22 men, according to the story, all buried on one property. But here's what makes this case different from almost every other one we cover. The murders might not be the real mystery here at all. The real mystery might be whether any of this actually happened. This is the story of Polly Bartlett, sometimes called the murderess of Slaughterhouse Gulch. And I want to be upfront with you from the start. Wyoming historians who've actually gone looking for evidence say they can't find any. No court records, no newspaper coverage from the time, nothing that confirms Polly Bartlett was ever a real person. And yet this story has been repeated for over a century, told as settled frontier history. By the end of this video, you'll understand both versions, the legend as it's told, and the far stranger question of how a story with zero evidence became treated as fact. As the story goes, Polly and her father ran a saloon in Ohio before ever setting foot in Wyoming. There, Polly would allegedly isolate male customers for sex, the story claims, while her father robbed them once they were vulnerable. Their first victim was supposedly a man named Lewis Nichols, from whom they took $4,000, an enormous sum in that era. That money, according to the legend, is what funded their move west and the construction of a lodge just outside South Pass City, Wyoming, a boomtown packed with prospectors and travelers thanks to an active gold rush. If the story is true, the lodge wasn't just a business, it was a trap built with the gold rush specifically in mind. South Pass City in the late 1860s was full of men carrying cash, gold, and valuables, with long, isolated stretches of road between towns. An inn that could offer a warm meal, a drink, and a bed was exactly the kind of place a tired traveler wouldn't think twice about trusting. According to the accounts, and it's worth repeating, these accounts have never been independently verified. Polly would welcome guests in, serve them a meal, and pour whiskey laced with arsenic. Her father, referred to in some versions as Jim and in others as John or Stephen, depending on which telling you read, itself a small sign of how shaky the sourcing on this case really is, would then help bury the bodies on the property. If anyone came asking questions about a missing traveler, the pair had a ready-made answer: blame local indigenous groups or blame outlaws passing through. In the lawless stretches of the territory at the time, that kind of explanation wouldn't have been hard to believe. The number most commonly repeated across retellings is 22 victims, every one of them allegedly recovered from the same property. That's a staggering number for any serial killer in any era, and it's exactly the kind of number that should make you raise an eyebrow rather than accept it outright. Real serial killer cases from this period, when they're genuinely documented, tend to come with fragments of evidence, a court transcript, a newspaper clipping, a grave count from an actual exhumation. This case, by contrast, largely traces back to a single source. Article from the year 1963 in a magazine called Real West, written by a man named Dean W. Ballinger, nearly a century after the murders supposedly took place. But let's stay inside the story for a moment, because whether or not it's true, it's still a good story, and understanding how it supposedly ended tells you a lot about why it might have been invented in the first place. The scheme, according to the legend, worked for years until August 1868, when the Bartletts allegedly killed the son of a mine owner named Bernard Fountain. This was the turning point. Unlike the drifters and anonymous travelers who disappeared before him, Fountain's son had a father with money, motive, and the means to act. Bernard Fountain didn't accept vague explanations about outlaws or indigenous raiders. He hired investigators from the Pinkerton Detective Agency, one of the most feared investigative operations in the country at the time, to find out what happened to his son. That's the moment the story shifts from quiet frontier crime to manhunt. The Pinkertons closing in on their property forced the Bartletts to flee, but not before, according to the legend. Investigators searched the land and unearthed the remains of several of their alleged victims. A bounty was placed on Polly and her father, and this is where the story introduces its most compelling character, a man named Ed Ford. Ford wasn't a hired lawman or a Pinkerton agent. He was someone with a personal stake. He had allegedly escaped the Bartletts himself at some point, only for his own brother, Sam, to become one of their victims afterward. Whether that detail is true or not, it gives the story an emotional core that a simple bounty hunt wouldn't have a man who survived driven to hunt down the people who killed his brother. On the 7th of October 1868, Ed Ford caught up with them. According to the account, he shot and killed Jim Bartlett on the spot and took Polly into custody to face trial for what they'd allegedly done. For a story this violent, you might expect the ending to involve a courtroom, a jury, a formal reckoning. It doesn't. That same evening, the very night she was taken into custody, Polly Bartlett was shot dead through the window of her jail cell. The man responsible was Otto Kalkhorst, a German-born miner who worked for Bernard Fountain, the same man whose son had allegedly been murdered months earlier. Kalkhorst was never charged. The Justice of the Peace who oversaw the case, Esther Hobart Morris, a real, well-documented historical figure, notably, the first woman to hold that position anywhere in the United States, declined to pursue charges, and the case was closed permanently the same day it technically began. No trial, no jury, no cross-examination of the evidence, just an accused woman shot dead hours after her arrest and a case that closed itself before it could ever really open. If you've been paying attention to how these stories usually go, that ending should feel familiar and also, frankly, a little too convenient. A neat, satisfying conclusion with no loose ends, no surviving witness to contradict any part of it, and no formal legal process to test whether any of it holds up. That's either exactly what happened on a lawless frontier in 1868, or it's exactly the kind of ending a storyteller invents when they don't want anyone asking follow-up questions. Here's where we have to step all the way back out of the legend. Historians who've actually dug into this case, not just repeated it, have come up empty. No period newspaper coverage of a string of 22 murders, which would have been sensational news anywhere in the country, let alone a small territory. No surviving court records from Polly Bartlett's arrest, brief as it apparently was. No verified grave sites, no exhumation records, no contemporary account from anyone in South Pass City at the time. The earliest detailed version of this story that historians can actually trace comes from that magazine article in 1963 written for a publication whose entire business model was dramatic, embellished tales of the Old West, sold to readers who wanted exactly that kind of story. Today, South Pass City is a preserved ghost town, kept in a state of arrested decay for visitors and historians. And locally, Bartlett's Inn isn't treated as a historical crime scene, it's treated as folklore, a story townspeople tell, not a case anyone treats as settled fact. So which is the real story here? Is it the 22 murders, the poisoned whiskey, the Pinkerton manhunt, and the vigilante justice that closed the case in a single night? Or is it something almost more interesting, a total fabrication that was compelling enough, dramatic enough, and just plausible enough for the lawless frontier era it claimed to come from, that it got repeated as history for over 60 years without anyone checking if it was true? Maybe the most unsettling thing about the Polly Bartlett story isn't a woman who killed 22 people. It's how easily an invented story, told with enough confidence, can become history, and how many other frontier legends we accept without ever asking the same question we just asked about this one. If cases like this keep you up wondering what's actually true, this is exactly what the Crime Shelf does every week. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next file.